Erik, Chapter 2. One of the few bright spots in my life was a small village church. The priest who had presided at my foster mother's funeral came knocking one day shortly afterward. He had been asking around about me after seeing the wire sculpture that I had made for her grave. I listened to him talking to my foster father, and he revealed that he had asked among our clients, many of whom had told him about the brilliant fixes I had made in their homes. The priest and my foster father agreed that I should be allowed to study music with the organist at the church in my spare time. The priest, of course, was always on the lookout for boys who could be trained into altar boys. Such youth would need to be disciplined and have a good voice with which to serve God. As I worked with the priest over the next couple of years, it was clear that I had the discipline and most especially the voice. I had a clear, pure, effortless soprano that made everyone who heard it sigh, weep, smile, or all three at once. But the priest refused to give me one of the coveted regular spots at the altar on Sunday, saying that God would be displeased having such deformity in his holy space. I reluctantly had to agree with this assessment, but I always came early to the church before Mass, hoping that a sudden illness of one of the other altar boys might open a last-minute spot for me. The rare Sundays when this happened were always a thrill for me. I would stand behind a hastily erected screen, listening to my voice soar over the noise of the congregation and resound from the dusty rafters. I wished that I could see their faces as they heard me. The priest always told me afterward how Madame Charpentier had wept, or how Mademoiselle Charlevoix had closed her eyes in rapture, or how Monsieur Tremblay had surreptitiously wiped his nose, trying to avoid the telltale evidence of emotion. I was always grateful to the priest for the way he spoke to me. He was one of the few whose eyes did not rivet themselves to my mask. He spoke to me the way he would to any parishioner, with companionable respect. The chance to sing and the respect from the priest made me seriously consider joining the priesthood for a while. The only thing that stopped me was the idea that God demands a perfect sacrifice, and I was definitely not. Also, there was the fact that I was not sure I believed in God. I was happy to lend my voice to the service, as I believed it made the congregants happy. But I never felt the thrill of personal faith while listening to the priest. Instead of reaffirming my belief, I would often sit and compile a list of questions I had for God, if we should ever meet. The question of why I look the way I look always topped the list. If I wasn't adding to my list of questions, I would page through the Bible, reading stories and parables at random. My favorite stories were the ones that told about miracles, although I am certain that the priest would say I approached them in the, quote, wrong spirit. I read each story carefully, looking for clues that might tell me about what was actually happening. I was convinced that each unexplainable occurrence in the Bible was the result of some natural process, perhaps one that man had already identified, or perhaps one that was as yet still unexplained. As I studied with the organist, I learned how to read the music that was demanded of me. I also picked up the ability to read French and Latin, although I had no idea what the Latin meant. I listened to him weave melodies together with his two hands on the piano in the choir room, and I wanted more than anything to learn how to do that. But the one time I sat down at the keyboard to try it out, I was shooed away from it angrily. The organist was fiercely protective of his instruments. I supposed it made sense. As far as I knew, this was the only piano in the whole village, paid for by pious donations to the church. If it were to be injured by incautious young hands, the church's music program and the organist's livelihood could be crippled. Another bright spot in my life was the annual fair that would pass through the village. I especially enjoyed watching the animal acts. Bears and tigers would perform on commands from their gypsy wranglers. They performed the most wonderful tricks. As I grew, I began to see the difference between a kind handler and a cruel one. Animals whose handlers were kind themselves, but animals whose handlers were cruel seemed capable of any manner of savagery. Unfortunately, it seemed to me that there was much more incentive for the handlers to be cruel, as savage animals tended to draw a bigger crowd. Sometimes the fair included deformed humans, too. People that were much too much like myself for me to be comfortable were displayed in much the same manner as the animals. I indulged my curiosity once and took a tour through that tent, and then shunned it ever after. The same principle applied to the humans as it did to the animals. The more they were mistreated, the more likely they seemed to hurl abuse or try to attack the crowds that gathered. I left the tent that day saddened for the lost souls of the people caged within. The summer that I was 9 years old, I started to sense a shift in the attitude of my foster parents. They did not know that I could hear their muttered conversation in bed through the walls in the night. I lay wakeful one night and heard something deeply troubling.
"It's been 3 months since we received the payment from his family, Shetty."
"Oh, you're always thinking of money. Can't you give it a rest?"
"No, I can't. Since you never think of our finances, it's left to me."
The noise of them kissing came through the wall, making me roll my eyes as I listened.
"No, monsieur, you can't kiss your way out of this. We need money. What will we do?"
My foster stepmother's voice was a little more strident now as she fended off his transparent attempt to distract her. An exasperated sigh came through the wall as my foster father realized there was no escaping this conversation. "I'm working as hard as I can." An amused huff indicated that my foster stepmother knew exactly how hard he worked and who did most of the heavy lifting in our little repair business. She chose not to mention it, though.
"If you would only charge a fair price, we'd be solvent. You can't pay the market vendors in friendship, you know, nor the landlord." "Anyway," she continued, "I've sent a letter to the family's lawyer to let them know they're behind. If they won't pay, then we need to make other arrangements."
My foster stepmother grew more and more worried as the next month passed by. It was clear to me that whoever this mysterious family was, they had no intention of making good on the debt they owed. I tried to eat less than I already did, as this was the only way I could think of to ease my burden on the family's budget. Fortunately, early berries were sometimes to be found in the woods on our journeys across the village to different work sites. The summer arrived, and with it, the traveling fair. My foster father and I set out for the fair on the last evening it was to be in town. He carried a small satchel with him, something that I found odd. I looked around dismally as I realized that the fair was in the process of packing up, and that I would not be able to see the exhibits in full swing. Large boxes of their gear sat at the little railway station already, ready to be placed on the train and moved to the next town. My foster father hailed a man who he seemed to know, and they disappeared into a tent to drink and talk together. I wandered freely among the tents, puzzling out what exhibits there had been by looking at what remained to be packed up. A long tube with a bore big enough for a man told me there had been an exciting act with a performer being shot out of a cannon. A tiny tub empty of water and a disassembled ladder lying in sections next to it told me there had been a high diving act. I sighed in disappointment. I had been looking forward to seeing that this year. I had seen it last year and had spent much of the time since then trying to figure out how the performer had so dramatically halted his momentum with such a scant cushion of water. A carton marked plates/batons indicated that the fair had a performer that would balance spinning plates on batons that he held in his hands. A deserted tent with a sign leaning against it indicated that Madame Brisson, a world-renowned clairvoyant, had been available to tell the future with her crystal ball. While I didn't have the coins that she required to tell the future, I wished I could have hung around outside the tent and listened to the spooky predictions she made. I wondered if there was a science to the things she told her customers, or if she simply made things up, counting on being far away by the time the customer realized the predictions were false. I completed my circuit of the fairgrounds and circled back to the tent where I had left my foster father. I knew that by now he was probably well into his cups, and resigned myself to having to support him on our way home. It certainly wasn't a new responsibility for me. I saw my foster father peek out of the tent and acknowledge that I was coming down the aisle, then beckoned me over to the tent with an urgent wave of his hand. He ducked back inside. I assumed he was saying his final farewells to his drinking companion. I pushed in through the tent flap after him, and when I woke up, I seemed to be moving. The floor shimmied and swayed underneath me. Though I had never experienced this before, I realized that I must be inside a train. The carriage was dark except for a single lantern that hung swaying from a post at the near end of the carriage. I sat up and looked around. My mind was spinning as I tried to figure out how in the world I had ended up here. I swiveled my head from side to side and realized that bars surrounded me on all sides. There was filthy straw on the floor and a filthier dish in the corner of the cage. Looking out through the bars, I could see 2 tigers looking rather uncomfortable inside a single cage, about the same size as the one I was in. I rapidly deduced that they had moved 2 tigers into one cage to free one up for me. I still didn't dare consider why they had put me in the cage, knowing that considering that aspect of it would be far more frightening. I panicked. I called out for my foster father, though rationally I knew he could not have been within miles of me. I stood up, banging my head on the low ceiling of the cage as I did so, and shook the bars of the cage, hoping they would yield to my force. I yelled in sheer rage. The tigers across the way roared with me, although whether in solidarity or irritation, I did not know. I stormed about the tiny space I now called my own, hoping that the tidal wave of my anger might carry me through the bars and back to my home, such as it was. I stilled as my gaze landed on something tossed into the corner of the cage. It was the satchel my foster father had carried to the fair. I fell on it and opened it, desperate to see what was inside this last reminder of the life I had known. I opened the bag to find a change of clothing, half a loaf of bread, and a note in my foster father's handwriting. "We can't keep you. You work for fair now. Mechanic. Be good." The bastard had sold me into slavery, or the modern equivalent, and he'd known he was going to do it. It hadn't been some drunken transaction, or else why bring the satchel? I sank down into the straw and brought my knees to my chest. As the shock wore off, the tears came freely. My mind circled wildly around the people I had seen in the, quote, human oddities tent, that one time that I had ventured inside. I had no doubt that I would be displayed right alongside the bearded lady, the hyper-flexible tall man, and the fellow with no hands who wrote fancy script with his feet. Eventually, my exhausted grief and the swaying motion of the train lulled me to sleep. I awoke to find daylight streaming through the narrow window at the top of the boxcar. I stood, shaking dirty straw from my shabby clothes. I had put on my best clothes to come to the fair, but they still were of poor quality and barely covered my growing limbs. I considered changing into my other set of clothing, but realized it would get just as dirty as the set I was wearing, and just as quickly. For the same reason, I did not want to bite into the loaf of bread too soon, preferring to save it for a better time, even though I had no possible idea what time that might be, or if it would ever come. The strong daylight gave me the chance to really inspect the lock that held me prisoner in this cage. I looked in every pocket of my clothing and the satchel, hoping to find something approximating the shape of the key. I thought I had an idea of how the lock could be picked, but I needed the right tool to do so. But my search turned up nothing. I sat back in the corner of my cage, awaiting further developments. Eventually, the train slowed and shuddered to a halt. I leaped to my feet once more, certain that someone would come now to release me. I do not know how long I stood there with my hands wrapped around the bars of the cage, looking pathetically out at the outside world and hoping for some kind soul to restore my life to rights. When 2 men finally did step into the car, they ignored my pleas and unloaded all the other boxes and cages in silence. Nothing I said made any impression on them. I began to wonder if they spoke any French at all. They certainly pretended not to understand it. Finally, they released the brake on my cage's wheels and rolled it carefully to the door of the car, down the ramp, and into the fairground. I blinked in the bright sunshine and looked around me. I caught a glimpse of a pretty town in the distance, its church spire rising white above the clustered houses around it. Then my view was obscured by the tents of the fair as I was rolled between them. I was brought inside a large tent and parked in the center. The men set the brake and turned to depart. There were more things to unload. They still hadn't said a word. I retreated to the corner of my cage again. I passed at least an hour, though I had no way of telling time, thinking of all the things I would do to my foster father if I ever saw him again. I had gotten as far in my inventions as locking him in a room with no alcohol when an important-looking personage strode into the tent and stopped before me. He spoke in a thick accent that was nearly impossible to understand. I learned later that he was a Russian gypsy, and he was the manager of the traveling fair. "You belong to me now. Star of the show. Give me the mask." I blinked at him while my mind scrambled to decipher what it was that he had said. Impatient, he repeated himself. "Mask. Now." I shook my head. In my 9 years, I could count the number of times I had been in public without a mask on one hand, and I wouldn't even have to use any fingers. I'd no sooner let myself be seen without my mask than I would without my pants. It simply wasn't decent. I backed away from where he held his hand through the bars, gesturing impatiently. I felt the bars of the far side of the cage come up behind me and stood there, staring at him in horror. Suddenly, I found myself unable to breathe. It all happened too fast for me to understand in the moment, but afterward, I figured out that the manager's bodyguard had come to the back of the cage where I stood and slipped a cord around my neck while my attention was riveted on the manager. While I struggled against the cord, the man slipped my mask off my face and made off with it. He released me from the cord, and I slipped to the floor, gasping and clutching my throat. Fool that I was. My first thought was that I might have to tell the priest that I was unavailable to sing next Sunday should he need me. I had heard horror stories of singers who were injured in the neck and thus ended their careers. I hadn't yet realized that I was miles away from the church and my old routine. I wouldn't test my singing voice in front of these men because some deep instinct told me to hide my skills. But I opened my mouth and croaked out a single question.
Why?
The manager turned, shrugged once, and said only, "Money. You make money. For me." Then he turned back and left the tent with my mask in his hand. I stood at the bars watching him leave. The tent flap fell behind him. Then I widened my gaze to the rest of the tent, as I realized I was the subject of intense scrutiny from the occupants of all the other cages that had been wheeled in while I was brooding. They were arranged in a circle around my cage in the center. My gaze darted from one twisted personage to the next, and I realized that the horror I felt on seeing them was reflected in their eyes as they looked at me. I gave an anguished wail and dropped to the floor, covering my head with my arms.